About John Birch, in a chapter called, appropriately enough, Who Was John Birch? Stevens writes as follows. John Birch was a young Baptist missionary in China when the Japanese occupied China during World War II. He served as intelligence advisor and interpreter for the Flying Tigers of General Claire Chennault until the Flying Tigers organization was integrated into the U.S. Army Air Corps. When the Army took over, Birch was commissioned a captain in the Army and continued his duties as intelligence officer for the Air Corps. At the end of the war, Birch was sent, with several Chinese, on a mission into territory held by the Chinese Communists. He was killed on this mission. It's worth noting here, as we'll see in a minute, that he was actually working for the OSS at this time. And recall that we took a look at how the Nazi Party began as an intelligence front, and one of the things to look at here is how the people who are going to wind up in the John Birch Society or are associated with it in any way come from the military and intelligence communities. And take note also of General Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers. Those were the very famous fighter pilots who basically their shark-nosed P-40s became very famous during World War II. And Madame Chennault, really his widow, was a key element of the China lobby, but John Birch, in addition to working for OSS, is his intelligence advisor.
Yeah, while on one hand, the people who flew over the hump into China during the time that the Chinese were cut off from the ocean by the Japanese invasion are a justly famous, a heroic bunch, because the flying over the hump, over the mountains into China, was probably one of the most hazardous things in aviation at that time, and these were men who did this several times a week, sometimes several times in a day. And Chennault was undoubtedly a very brave flyer himself and his men, and they carried on for a long time themselves the war against the Japanese on behalf of the United States government when there was no official military commitment in China by the United States. However, on the other hand, as Dave mentioned, the name Chennault is a bit of a flag because later on, Chennault, who was a rabid supporter of Chiang Kai-shek, he and then especially his wife after he died became very, very early proponents of the China lobby and were among the people that helped to start the entire McCarthy era off on its way by their allegations about waffling in the State Department and lukewarm support for anti-communist governments like Chiang Kai-shek's and accusations of this sort. Anyway, back to John Birch again and his military and his intelligence background. I'm going to read a short segment here from a book called The Secret File on John Birch, written by James and Marty Heffley, H-E-F-L-E-Y, copyright 1980 by Tyndall House Publishers, Inc. Okay. Although official U.S. policy viewed the communist movement as an internal problem, the Heffleys write, the Chinese would have to solve for themselves. The American military had been on the scene long enough to realize the potential danger to peace in China. Wiedemeyer and the OSS men were determined the communists would not take advantage of the end-of-war confusion. When John, that's John Birch, and Miller kept their morning radio schedule on August 19th, they learned that both were bound for the same city, Suzhou, where a large Japanese headquarters facility and airfield was located. In the euphoria of knowing that the war was over, they disregarded code and talked openly about how they would get there. Quote, I'm taking a junk down the Yellow, meaning the Yellow River, to Pengpu, and I'll catch the train north to Suzhou from there, Miller said. Why not come with me? Skipping on down. The next morning, John, again John Birch, assembled his party. They included 3 other Americans, Lieutenant Laird Ogle, a specialist in morale intelligence, Sergeant Albert C. Myers, a radio technician, and Albert Grimes, a civilian OSS operative skilled in counter-espionage. Grimes wore a 14th Air Force captain's uniform and was second in command. Assisting the uniformed Americans were 5 Chinese officers and 2 Japanese-speaking Koreans who went along as interpreters. The group of 11 carried 27 pieces of baggage and 3 radios. One of the Chinese, Lieutenant Dung Fuquan, was assigned as John Birch's aide. They left about 1 p.m., trekked northward to a town on the Yellow River, and took a junk, a day's journey northeast to another point on the river. They again turned north, walking all night until they reached Quete on the Lunghai Railroad about noon. Here they were received courteously by a Japanese commander, who assured them that they would be well received in Suzhou. However, he warned that the communist guerrillas were causing trouble along the railroad to the east. The group spent Wednesday and Thursday nights at Quai, then proceeded with 2 Chinese who had been collaborating with the Japanese, General Peng and his orderly Lai Yu-Ching. General Peng was to escort them to his counterpart, the puppet General Ho, in Suchow, in other words, another man who had been working for the Japanese. It was understood that John was still in command of the mission. They boarded an eastbound train at Quai the next morning. John still believed the Communists would not interdict an American mission on a main railroad line traveling under direct orders of General Wiedemeyer. They encountered no delay for the first 45 miles. Then the train halted at Tangshan Station. After a few minutes of waiting, John sent the Koreans to ask the Japanese station master what was the holdup. The Koreans reported back that the line had been sabotaged ahead, and Communists, Japanese, and Chinese puppet troops were also fighting in the area. Until the line was repaired and things calmed, the train would remain at Tangshan. Okay, skipping on down. They talk about a priest who came and a Portuguese Catholic priest came and told them that the Communists had killed many of his men. John Birch and Ogle hurried back to the railroad and found a Japanese patrol had arrived on a handcar bringing replacement rails. Some of the Jap soldiers were pounding the new rails in place. Others had taken up defensive positions on both sides of the railroad as if they expected trouble. At John's request, the patrol commander directed his men to move the handcar over the break and load in the group's baggage. He and his men then escorted them to the station, where a large supply train was guarded by a garrison of about 600 Japanese troops.
Now, the rest of the story here basically is sort of consists of dialogue, reconstructed dialogue, as the Heffleys have sort of used it, as they state in the beginning of the book. The dialogue here is invented by them. The events are real, but they sort of used a little literary license, I guess you could say, to fill in the dialogue here. So the rest of this account of the death of John Birch is dialogue. We're not going to go read you the dialogue per se. We'll tell you basically what happened. John Birch, now recall his mission here. He's traveling along railway lines with active assistance from disarmed, I guess you could really regard them as turned Japanese soldiers, because recall that we were, meaning U.S. policy in that area through Chiang Kai-shek, was willing to enlist the armed support of the Japanese against the Chinese Communists, in essence affecting a uniform switch, as we mentioned. Perhaps more importantly, John Birch, now recall that Wiedemeyer had authorized American forces and, in particular, OSS to accept the surrender of Japanese on behalf of Chiang Kai-shek, and this put them in direct conflict with the Chinese Communists. And recall, of course, that throughout this time there's been a continuation of combat. In other words, this was 1 week to the day after VJ Day that John Birch died, and basically the fighting has gone on unabated. The fighting that had proceeded throughout World War II is still going on, only a nominal shift of uniforms on behalf of the Japanese who are guarding railway lines here. And John Birch now is working with, among others, 2 Chinese puppet soldiers who had been collaborating with the Japanese, and specifically part of his mission was to escort them to the puppet General Ho in Suchow, their ultimate destination. As seen here, these groups were receiving active aid from the Japanese, the very Japanese who had bombed Pearl Harbor and who had been America's enemies 1 week before, and who, as we mentioned, were involved in a continuous combat throughout this period, stretching, of course, throughout World War II and right up to this point, where right now we're, in August 15th, 1945. And that basically these are the people with whom John Birch was working and traveling. Now, what Birch went into Chinese territory, was stopped by the Chinese, who took due note of his puppet associates and his association with the Japanese. However, they were quite willing to allow him to pass through their territory and to fulfill his request to meet with their commanding officer. The bone of contention was that they wanted to disarm Birch and his party. Birch and his party refused to be disarmed, and in fact, according to all accounts, some of Birch's own associates warned him that his attitude was a little too truculent. At any rate, eventually, the attempt to disarm them by the Chinese led to a fight, and there was shooting, and John Birch and several of the Chinese were killed. Okay, so, but these are the circumstances under which Birch died. Basically, for all intents and purposes, fighting with the Axis here. He's working with Chinese puppet troops and Japanese troops, and note that the Japanese are fully armed here and are taking up defensive positions on this railroad. Then when the Chinese Communists want to disarm him, Birch stages an argument and is killed. So that is how John Birch died. Now, Returning again to the John Birch Society in California politics, an assessment of John Birch's death here from one of his OSS compatriots. Again, the author Brian W. Stevens. On Friday, March 31st, 1961, Joseph S. Sample, S-A-M-P-L-E, president of a radio and television company in Billings, Montana, and who served in the same Office of Strategic Services with John Birch, wrote in his byline column in the weekly Yellowstone News that John Birch was no hero and did not die in glory. Sample wrote, Birch was a man with no particularly distinguishing characteristics, a little stiff perhaps, but a not very high regard for the Chinese and somewhat self-important, but nothing unusual. If he had strong political convictions, they were not in evidence. Describing the situation in China in 1945, when civil war seemed inevitable, Sample said Birch was assigned a mission in central China. So basically, in the minds of at least one of his compatriots, he was no hero, and the circumstances we've already recited. He was basically acting on behalf of the Chiang Kai-shek government to accept the surrender of Japanese troops, working with Chinese puppet troops, and with Japanese who had been kept under arms and were continuing to fight, even though this was barely a week after the official Japanese surrender. And remember that all covert operations were going through Wiedemeyer's office, and that Chiang's chief of military intelligence was Louis Siefken.
Okay, and with that, and since we're coming up to the top of the hour, we're going to take another short break and take this moment to give you all a chance to get up and stretch, and believe me, we will take the same opportunity. So, coming back, we're going to continue on a little bit more with some other things you may not know about the John Birch Society and their connections into... So much for the restful break here. I just want to make the 9-second dash out to the lobby and back in again. This is Nip Tuck in the studios with Dave Emery, and you are listening to Radio Free America, in which we are going into, I guess, our third segment tonight. And while I catch my breath, I'll let Dave recap some of what we just talked about.
Alrighty, we're not sure how long this is going to take. We may actually have some time for some phone calls later, so if there are some of you out there whose cerebral cortices have not been totally numbed out by this avalanche of information, maybe you can avalanche some information back at us or ask us some questions or whatever. Anyway, starting off, we began by taking a look at efforts on behalf of a number of different people, once again on behalf of General Douglas MacArthur, and specifically trying to get him elected president. Some of the people we looked at were General Robert Wood, who was head of a pro-Nazi organization called America First, which was a major thorn in the side of the Allied forces in World War II, because essentially it threatened America's involvement against Nazi Germany. Robert Wood was very close to General Douglas MacArthur, was a long-time supporter of MacArthur for president. Now, we took a look also at how a number of different people, including Robert Wood, vied for a MacArthur candidacy in the 1944 election. Now, MacArthur himself allowed the legwork for that to be done by his officers. We took a look at how the Army itself, within the upper echelons of U.S. military planning, American troops originally to be sent to Europe to land in Normandy on D-Day were in fact being sent to the Pacific to help speed up MacArthur's victory there, and hopefully to bring him home, on the part of these people, to bring him home for a 1944 candidacy. One of the people most centrally involved with that was Albert Wiedemeyer. We then looked at Wiedemeyer and Hanford McNider, another MacArthur staffer working to get MacArthur nominated in 48. Hanford McNider was the second choice of the Morgan Group in the 1934 military coup attempt that we spoke about earlier on Radio Free America number 1, and that we've alluded to, Aryan Nations number 1, and that we've alluded to here. After that, we took a look at Wiedemeyer's associations with a number of different people, a number of different Nazis, including a key Freikorps leader and stormtroop leader. We took a look at his close friendship with the the chief of the German General Staff, who was vehemently Nazi, although equally vehemently anti-Hitler. It was a question of methodology, not ideology. And we've also taken a look at Wiedemeyer's association with, among others, America First. Now, Wiedemeyer then goes on to become the theater commander of all U.S. forces in China, specifically replacing Joseph Stilwell, because apparently Wiedemeyer was willing to give Chiang Kai-shek more leash to fight the communists, or at least to husband his strength for the upcoming Civil War. We also took a look at how the muddied pattern of events in China led to the death of John Birch. We took a look at how all covert operations in China went through Wiedemeyer's office in conjunction with OSS. We took a look at how the chief of military intelligence for Chiang Kai-shek had been, during World War II, the head of a Nazi spy ring in Shanghai, which, according to reliable accounts, was the vehicle through which the Japanese obtained critical intelligence in preparation for their attack on Pearl Harbor. That man then jumps to Chiang Kai-shek's intelligence at the end of the war. Jumping to Chiang Kai-shek along with Louis Siefken were large numbers of Chinese puppet troops, Chinese nationals who had aided the Japanese during the World War II, also many Japanese troops themselves who were used, among other things, to guard railways. We took a look at John Birch, the intelligence advisor to General Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers, and a man who, on an OSS mission to basically accept the, quote, surrender, returning in all probability, of a Japanese and Chinese puppet garrison at Shangchao, that Birch, while working in conjunction with Japanese troops under arms continuing the combat against the Chinese communists, and in combination with Chinese puppet troops, it basically was waylaid by the Chinese, and when he refused to be disarmed, an altercation resulted, which resulted in John Birch's death. Now, John Birch, of course, is the martyr designate and the person for whom the John Birch Society is named. And what we're going to be taking a look at now is the number of retired military officers and intelligence people that moved into the John Birch Society. And specifically, the question we're going to be asking here is what we're suggesting is a similarity between the John Birch Society and the German Nazi Party. Recall that in its inception, the German Nazi Party was a front for Reichswehr intelligence, and specifically the vehicle for the introduction of the German army into civilian society so that it could eliminate the political opponents of the general staff and top industrialists. And eventually this led specifically, of course, to the Third Reich when that work was complete. And what we're going to be looking at is, among other things, the large number of people from MacArthur's staff, who we've been looking at, who wound up in the John Birch Society, the number of people from the China lobby who wound up in the Birch Society. And recall that Wiedemeyer was very close to MacArthur and was part of the group of officers angling to get MacArthur elected president. And eventually what we're going to be looking at is the role of John Birch elements in the assassination of President Kennedy, and we're going to ask, the question is basically, was the Kennedy assassination, as we believe, a military coup, and was this the culmination of, among other things, a constitutional conflict between the executive branch and the military? And these are some questions we're going to be asking here, and it's worth noting, if it's not altogether clear how this is going to tie in with the Aryan nations, we're talking about the history of American fascism here. And one of the questions we're suggesting, just as we're suggesting a comparison between the John Birch Society and the German Nazi Party in its inception, we're also suggesting a comparison between the Aryan nations and the sort of paramilitary right, the mercenaries who are so much in evidence these days, and the Freikorps and the Black Reichswehr, the underground extensions of the German military, which, although they were frequently at odds with the general staff and were the subject of a great deal of controversy, were put together by the German military in order to dispatch their political opponents. And we're going to take a look at, in the next program, at specifically the involvement of Aryan nations elements in people involved with Aryan nations in not only the assassination of President Kennedy, but also this country's other major political assassinations as well.
Okay, going to read a couple of short selections from a book called The Truth About the John Birch Society. That's by Richard Vahan, copyright 1962, a McFadden book in paperback. And Vahan was a staff writer for the Boston Herald, had done a lot of political writing, things of that nature. Okay, he's talking now to begin with about a magazine by the name of American Opinion, which is, of course, a publication of the John Birch Society. And he says, besides the listing of the staff in the masthead of American Opinion, there is a list of names referred to as the Editorial Advisory Committee. Below the heading, a brief note to the reader tells him that the following named persons are not responsible for anything written in the magazine, but that they are occasionally called on for advice and comments, and to aid in determining the editorial policy, contents, and opinions expressed in American Opinion. Of the 30 people listed, Vahan writes, 9 are members of the Council of the John Birch Society, and 1 was a member until his death. The names of several are familiar to most Americans. General Albert C. Wiedemeyer and actor Adolphe Menjou are among the committee members, for example. Okay, before going on, obviously Albert Wiedemeyer is somebody that we're looking at in depth tonight and will continue to, so you can file that away in his position on the masthead as a member of the advisory committee of the John Birch Society publication. Adolphe Menjou is interesting, too, in light of the fact that Adolphe Menjou was one of the prime Hollywood backers of the McCarthy Committee, and in fact cooperated so extensively with the McCarthy Committee that many people thought of him as practically being a member of the McCarthy Committee's hearings in Hollywood. This is interesting for a variety of reasons, one of them being the recent revelations in the newspapers about Ronald Reagan's work on behalf of the House Un-American Activities folks and his work as a confidential informant on, quote, communism in Hollywood, unquote. Anyway, just something to file away, going along with Van's book. Finally, there is Lieutenant General Charles B. Stone III, U.S. Army retired, who, during World War II, succeeded Brigadier General Claire Chennault as commanding general of the 14th U.S. Air Force in China. General Stone is now lifetime honorary chairman of the 14th Air Force Association. Of the entire council membership, General Stone is the only one who actually knew John Birch. Until his death, Birch served under Stone's command. Okay, skipping along here a little bit. Now, Van takes up the subject of Edwin A. Walker, Major General Edwin A. Walker, who at the time this book was written was not nearly as well-known and controversial a figure, although quite well-known and controversial as he would later become. Bear in mind, this book was copyright 1962. But he talks about Walker and the fact that Walker was discharged, drummed out of the military basically for using Army facilities to disseminate John Birch Society propaganda to the men of his command in the 24th Infantry Division. Anyway, Van writes, Walker, a West Point graduate who was 50 years old when the controversy broke, served during World War II in Italy, France, Germany, Norway, and the Aleutians. For a while, he was military advisor to the Chinese nationalists, and he saw action during the Korean War. By 1957, he was in command of the Arkansas Military District. When the integration crisis broke at Little Rock Central High School, Walker was in command of the troops sent there by then-President Eisenhower to keep peace. Very interesting. Also interesting in light of the fact of what Walker will later turn to be a critical part of, and what event he will turn out to be a critical part of, because that, in part, also ties up with the numerous problems going on with integration in the United States at that time. But again, note the China lobby. Note General Edwin Walker, prominent John Birch Society member, actually disseminating John Birch propaganda to his military wards, that he also was military advisor to the Chinese nationalists. Skipping on down through Van's book, also talking about other prominent members, Colonel Lawrence E. Bunker, Jr. is now a prominent Boston attorney. For 6.5 years during the occupation of Japan and part of the Korean War, Colonel Bunker was personal aide to General of the Army Douglas MacArthur, and he remained MacArthur's aide even after the general was relieved of his command of the United Nations forces in Korea. So again, Lawrence E. Bunker, which we mentioned earlier in the broadcast, and Dave will refresh your memory on that, also part of the Council of the John Birch Society, another MacArthur functionary.
Okay, now, we've taken a look at some key members of the China lobby who wound up in JBS. Wiedemeyer, in charge of the China Theater when John Birch is killed. Charles Stone, John Birch's commanding officer. General Edwin Walker, also military advisor to the nationalist Chinese. And the intersection between Wiedemeyer and the MacArthur group we've looked at, we're going to come back to that. And MacArthur's top aide, Lawrence Bunker, also a prominent member of the John Birch Society. We're going to take a look at a couple of other key MacArthur aides here who also wound up in the JBS. Returning once again to the John Birch Society and California Politics by Brian W. Stevens, and again, research credit to this to Mae Brussel. Referring here to a California Senate subcommittee investigation, Subcommittee on Un-American Activities investigation of the John Birch Society, which basically exonerated the John Birch Society of being a dangerous or subversive organization. The subcommittee shows that Newbery writes for Newbery, by the way, was a person who had been very, very critical of the John Birch Society, accused it of being a fascist organization, and was then pilloried by the investigation of the California Senate Subcommittee on Un-American Activities. The subcommittee shows that Newbery writes for the Weekly Worker in New York, and the Newbery piece the subcommittee quotes from a booklet written by Newbery in 1961 called The Fascist Revival, The Inside Story of the John Birch Society. The style used in the Newbery booklet, the subcommittee states, is the same style used by most communist propagandists. The unfortunate error on the part of the subcommittee in its report is that the subcommittee used the testimony of one Edward Hunter, Hunter, before the United States Senate Internal Security Subcommittee to prove the connection between Newbery and the Communist Party. Quoting Hunter's testimony, the California Subcommittee report states that Mr. Hunter is, quote, an expert on psychological warfare, unquote. It is more likely to do Newbury good than harm. For Hunter, Newbury's accuser is the chairman of the Anti-Communist Liaison Committee of Correspondence, created in March of 1962 by Billy James Hargis, Hargis, head of the Christian Crusade. 3 of the other 4 members of this committee which Hunter heads are General Charles Willoughby, U.S. Army retired, Washington representative of the Christian Crusade, and listed in the same 1963 report of the California Senate Subcommittee as, quote, occupying a position of leadership, unquote, in the John Birch Society. General Bonner Fellers, Fellers, a U.S. Army retired, National Director of For America, another right-wing extremist group, and none other than John Rousselot, National Public Relations Director of the John Birch Society. In other words, the experts who were used by the California Subcommittee to discredit the critics of the John Birch Society are in reality leaders and directors of Birch Society front organizations. The 2 names we want to focus on here, well, let me go down a little further. Thus did the California Senate Subcommittee on Un-American Activities set the fox to guard the chickens. Mr. Edward Hunter is also available as a speaker through the American Opinion Speakers Bureau, run by John Rousselot, which is also now the publisher of the Birch Society's monthly magazine, American Opinion, which was formerly published by Robert Welch. Hunter also serves on the advisory board of Young Americans for Freedom. We're going to come back to Young Americans for Freedom. Note here that General Charles Willoughby, born Karl Adolf Wiedenbach, a German national educated, according to one account, at the same Kriegswehr Academy that General Wiedemeyer later attended. He was a doctrinaire fascist, an admirer of Francisco Franco, and he was also General MacArthur's G2, his top military intelligence man in the Pacific throughout the entire course of World War II and Korea until MacArthur was replaced. Also a name here we're not familiar with, we're going to come back to him, General Bonner Fellers, Fellers. Fellers was a key MacArthur aide also, and like so many of the others we've been looking at and are going to look at, wound up in the John Birch Society. So Fellers and Willoughby, the 2 names we want to look at here.
Okay, I'm going to read us a few segments now from a very, very interesting book called Farewell America. The title, the name on the masthead is James Hepburn, spelled like Audrey or Katharine Hepburn, published by Frontiers, copyright 1968. Although the story of the book Farewell America is a very complex one, which we probably don't have the time to tell you all about tonight, but essentially through a series of revelations and investigations, it was discovered that this book, a book very critical of the Warren Commission treatment of the John F. Kennedy assassination, among other things, and suggesting that some of the real causes for the Kennedy assassination could be traced directly back to the military and intelligence infrastructure of the United States, and specifically to right-wingers therein located. It turns out, according to William Turner, the man who got the manuscript, that in fact the authors, not the author, of the book Farewell America is not James Hepburn, but in fact a group of people from the SDECE, the French intelligence agency. Do you think we should tell them some of the things about how that all came about, or
just ever so briefly? In the Rebel magazine, it had been known for some time that Farewell America and James Hepburn, well, basically James Hepburn and Frontiers publisher, were essentially fronts for one intelligence service or another. The debate had raged. The general consensus was that this was the French intelligence service, which had been investigating the Kennedy assassination because the Permindex or Centro Mondiale Commerciale in NATO intelligence front that was used as the funding conduit for the Kennedy assassination, and that's covered in our Guns of November number 4, our archive series about the Kennedy assassination, that basically they had investigated the Kennedy assassination because the same people behind the attempts on French President Charles de Gaulle's life were successful in getting rid of President Kennedy. According to Turner, and he was the guy that brought this book into the country, we're going to touch back on another one of Bill Turner's books. He was front and center in our Robert Kennedy broadcast, a former FBI agent and now private investigator and author. Basically, Farewell America was given to him by a French intelligence agent acting on behalf of the SDECE. His name, and Turner was not at all sure that was what his real name is, but his given name was Hervé Lamarre, Hervellamarr. And basically, it had been known, as I say, for a long time that Farewell America was not done by any private researcher. It was not only so detailed and just so lavishly footnoted and so forth. Well, It's possible to do a lavishly footnoted book, but this one appeared extremely lavishly footnoted, and beyond that, showed an awareness of assassination techniques and betrayed inside information or discussed inside information that was simply beyond the scope of other researchers. For example, in talking about how the assassination happened, there's a discussion of the fact that the bullets were of a special silver and lead alloy, unjacketed so that they would disintegrate on impact, and that they were specially cast for this assassination. Now, that's information that no one had ever had before. It's typical of the kinds of revelations about the Kennedy assassination in this book. And because of that kind of information, it was generally considered that this was the work of an intelligence agency. It's an excellent book, one of the best on the Kennedy assassination. We did not use it in our Guns of November broadcast because at that time, in November of 83, it was not known which intelligence service had done this, and until we had the goods on that, the consensus was SDECE. But in February of 84, I believe it was, anyway, in an issue of the Rebel magazine, a short-lived investigative publication we're going to be using in a little while, there was a long story by Bill Turner of just how he brought the book in, and he correctly identified what most people had thought, which was that it was the SDECE. So this book, put together by French intelligence.
Okay, again, reading from Farewell America, and he's talking to begin with about H.L. Hunt, of course, previously mentioned Texas oil billionaire and owner of 300 radio stations and 55 television stations beaming Nazified propaganda out across the airwaves.
And one of the linchpins of the John Birch Society.
Hunt's brand of anti-communism has found support in the military camp. In 1952, Hunt supported the MacArthur for President campaign, and he has called MacArthur, quote, truly the man of this century. He was also impressed by the MacArthur-trained group of strategists. And skipping down to the footnote to this, it says, which included former generals like Courtney Whitney and Bonner Fellers, and also certain of their disciples, such as the brilliant Lawrence Bunker, and we've mentioned all these people earlier.
Courtney Whitney, recall, he's a key MacArthur aide, and in Guns of Aryan Nations Part 1, we took a look at a book called MacArthur in Korea by Robert Smith, and in there, Courtney Whitney, after hearing someone describe MacArthur as being a not very good general, exploded and commented to his fellow rail passengers that he must be a kike.
So Courtney Whitney was obviously of at least slightly anti-Semitic leanings. To put it mildly. Going on with H.L. Hunt, he once declared, quote, we should do whatever our generals advise us to do, unquote. Beginning in 1952, several influential military men, flattered by Hunt's attention and conscious of his power, acquired the habit of consulting and confiding in him. Thus, General George C. Kenney, born in 1889, former commanding general of the Strategic Air Command, who retired from the Air Force in 1951, told him of his personal plan for knocking out Russia's nuclear capacity based on the strategy of a preventive strike. General Albert C. Wiedemeyer, born in 1897, author of the Wiedemeyer Reports and an active member of the John Birch Society, retired from the Army in 1951. And Admiral James Van Fleet, born in 1892 and retired from the Navy in 1953, were among the specialists consulted by Hunt, who shared their passion for strategy and extermination. The advent of Kennedy and McNamara created a stir among the military, and there were many retirements and dismissals. The leader of this warrior clan was General Edwin A. Walker, born in 1909, a Texan who returned to Dallas after leaving the Army and contacted H.L. Hunt. Then, with the support of the John Birchers, the Minutemen, and several of his former subordinates in the U.S. forces in Germany, he launched an extremist and militarist campaign. Robert A. Surrey, Walker's associate, had the financial backing of Hunt's companies. In 1962, ex-General Walker ran for governor of Texas, but was defeated by John Connally, whereupon he plunged headlong into a campaign of politico-economic action. By winter of 1962 to 63, plans were being made for a preventive strike. And of course, they're not talking about a preventive strike on the Russians. Skipping on down, asking rhetorically, the authors write, what would be the advantages and the consequences of President Kennedy's disappearance, meaning disappearance from the scene or death? General Walker answered that question after the assassination when he declared, quote, even if they aren't noticeable immediately, there will be considerable changes. Skipping down to the footnote, this was quoted in U.S. News and World Report. Another military man as interested and active as General Walker, Colonel Lawrence E. Bunker, also previously mentioned, General MacArthur's staff staff aide declared, quote, "It's Kennedy or death," unquote.
So basically, we have the stage set here for not only the assassination of President Kennedy, but at a deeper level, the assumption of total authority by the military. And what we're going to be examining here and suggesting is that essentially the Kennedy assassination was a military coup. It was a coup d'etat in which the forces that had tried unsuccessfully in 1934 and 1939 to subvert the U.S. and basically to overthrow the constitutional government succeeded on November 22nd, 1963. And again, taking a look at the retired military officers from the China lobby and their intersection with the MacArthur group and how so many of them turned up. And let's just once again run down the cast of characters. Wiedemeyer, theater commander in China, the guy who dispatched Birch on his fatal mission, John Birch Society. Charles Stone, Birch's commanding officer, John Birch Society. General Edwin Walker, former Chinese nationalist military advisor, John Birch Society. We also took a look at Lawrence Bunker, staff aide to MacArthur, John Birch Society. We also took a look at Bonner Fellows, key MacArthur aide, MacArthur staffer, John Birch Society. We took a look at Courtney Whitney, John Birch Society. We also took a look at who am I forgetting? Charles Willoughby, lest we forget, the German-born and doctrinaire fascist intelligence chief from MacArthur. Also, again, John Birch Society, and very prominent in same.
Not to mention, of course, Van Horn Moseley and Potter Gale and the others that we talked about, and their direct relation to various Nazi groups, and Potter Gale and his connection to the Aryan nations themselves.
Now, one of the things we're going to be looking at, too, is, again, this image where you could think of it as a wishbone or a tuning fork, where basically fascism in Germany and fascism in the United States are not only related, but are essentially outgrowths of the same transatlantic industrial and financial axis that we've spoken about. And we're going to take it, basically, we're going to examine in weeks to come, we're going to, in shows to come, I really should say, whether or not we're going to be taking a look, as we've suggested, at the comparison between the Nazi Party as a vehicle for introducing the German army into the Weimar Republic civilian society and the John Birch Society, and ask, is the JBS, which, if you look at the sort of inventory of the far right, just about everyone sooner or later, at one point in their career, was a John Birch member, all of the luminaries on the far right. And what we're asking is, what is the John Birch Society basically a military intelligence front? In essence, of course, it has expanded beyond just the military. So did the Nazi Party, and very quickly. There were always industrialists behind that, as there were behind the John Birch Society. But we're looking at it and asking this question. We're also asking, in light of the intimate relationship between the Freikorps and Black Reichswehr and the Nazi Party, is what relationship between the political assassinations of the 60s, the assassinations of the Kennedys and Martin Luther King and so forth, and the Aryan nations that we're going to be looking at. We're going to suggest that the Aryan nations and the mercenary groups springing up are in essence the Freikorps, an underground extension of the military. One thing that we might comment upon at this juncture is that there's a sort of a very close relationship that, in a sense, you almost never really retire from the military. You may get off active duty, but one of the things that has come to light, particularly in light of the over-budgeting of the Pentagon, is the sort of revolving door which exists between retired military and people either connected with the defense industries, and we're also going to look at defense industry connections to the Aryan nations in the next broadcast, and the active military itself. John Singlaub, who is basically the president of the World Anti-Communist League and allegedly a retired general, is pretty much directing the so-called private aid being channeled to the Contras right now in Nicaragua. So retired military is a phrase one should take with a certain degree of salt, at least regarding some of the people we're talking about here. We're going to take a look at a really ominous circumstance here, and again we're going to come back to JBS, the Hunts, Edwin Walker, and so forth, and we're going to begin connecting up some of the events in Germany and the United States and examining what we feel was basically a military coup d'etat. And obviously this is not a thesis that's original with us. This has been suggested by many other investigators of the Kennedy assassination. Reading now from a book called Spooks, subtitled The Haunting of America, The Private Use of Secret Agents. That was authored by Harper's National Security Editor Jim Hogan, H-O-U-G-A-N, published in hardcover by William Morrow and Company in New York in 1978. Hogan writes, "Working for the very wealthy can be hazardous to your health, however, as former FBI agent Paul Rothermeil, R-O-T-H-E-R-M-E-I-L, claims to have discovered. In conversations with reporter Peter Noyes and subsequently with myself, Rothermeil described his peculiar past association with the fabulously wealthy Hunt family of Texas. While employed in the Secret Service of the Patriarch, H.L. Hunt, Rothermile said that the old man's son, Nelson Bunker Hunt, approached him in connection with a plan to form a paramilitary group for political purposes, unquote, a killer force that would train on desert estates in the West. A connoisseur of racehorses and right-wing causes alike, Nelson Bunker Hunt is an important contributor to the John Birch Society and a confidant of its maximum leader, Robert Welch. He is also one of the world's richest men, having at one time held title to all the oil in Libya. According to Rothermile, however, Hunt was not content with mere riches and therefore organized the so-called American Volunteer Group, AVG, organized it, that is, with supposedly legal intent. Recounting the story, the former G-man contends that Hunt planned to recruit his private army from the ranks of General Edwin Walker's Birch Society cell in Dallas. The weapon of choice, Rothermile claimed, was to be a type of gas gun, unquote, imported from Europe, a weapon whose singular virtue was that its victims would appear to have died of heart attacks. Asked to join the paramilitary unit in a war on liberals and the left, Rothermile says he refused. It was then that he found his telephone had been tapped by other spooks in Hunt's employ, and he began to fear for his life. Skipping down, Rothermile's story is a bizarre one that may be impossible to prove or disprove. In conversations with this reporter, it's clear that the former Hunt employee remains frightened of his old boss, and there is no doubt that his telephone was tapped. As for the AVG itself, its short history is a bloody one that's led investigators, most notably Peter Noyes, into an extremist's wonderland. Seeking out its origins and training bases, Noyes had reason to interview Minuteman leader Robert DePugh, D-E, capital P-U-G-H, who described the group in terms of a runaway apparat whose politics were extreme even for him. Others connected to the group in one way or another included a wealthy California car dealer whose private arsenal of weapons is said to exceed that of some small countries, a far-right cleric whose desert ranch is surrounded by armed guards, and a defrocked California cop. This last individual, living in a trailer outfitted as an electronics command post, claimed that the AVG's founding leader was an ex-Marine, Captain Medrick Johnson. A Bircher and a Minuteman, Johnson became national chairman of the AVG in May of 1968, journeying from Southern California to Borger, Texas, to implement the group's policies. A couple of things here before Nip Tuck goes on to read you some more about AVG. Take note here that basically what they're doing are forming death squads here, that the Hunts, Nelson Bunker Hunt here, has expressed the desire to form death squads, that they were going to be recruited from General Edwin Walker's Birch Society cell in Dallas, and perhaps most interesting, they were going to use a gas gun imported from Europe, which would make its victims appear to have died from heart attacks. Because one of the things we've been talking about on our regular programs concerns the large number of people who of progressive political persuasion who have been turning up dead of apparently undetermined causes, i.e. apparent heart attacks, for many, many years now. And recall that just such death squads, albeit with a more primitive technology, were at the root of the Third Reich. Basically, they paved the way for its rise. And we've also looked at the connections between some of the elements bringing fascism to Germany and fascism to the United States. And we're going to take a look at this sort of transatlantic cooperation and so forth, and suggest to you that perhaps the accountings here of the AVG are not quite so ridiculous, and suggest to you that perhaps these death squads have been going on for a long time.
Was assigned as John Birch's aide. They left about 1 p.m., trekked northward to a town on the Yellow River, and took a junk, a day's journey northeast, to another point on the river. They again turned north, walking all night until they reached Quete, on the Lunghai Railroad, about noon. Here they were received courteously by a Japanese commander, who assured them that they would be well received in Soochow. However, he warned that the communist guerrillas were causing trouble along the railroad to the east. The group spent Wednesday and Thursday nights at Quete, then proceeded with 2 Chinese who had been collaborating with the Japanese, General Peng and his orderly Lai Yu-Ching. General Peng was to escort them to his counterpart, the puppet General Ho, in Soochow, in other words, another man who had been working for the Japanese. It was understood that John was still in command of the mission. They boarded an eastbound train at Quete the next morning. John still believed the communists would not interdict an American mission on a main railroad line traveling.
About John Birch, in a chapter called, appropriately enough, Who Was John Birch?, Stevens writes as follows. John Birch was a young Baptist missionary in China when the Japanese occupied China during World War II. He served as intelligence advisor and interpreter for the Flying Tigers of General Claire Chennault until the Flying Tigers organization was integrated into the U.S. Army Air Corps. When the Army took over, Birch was commissioned a captain in the Army and continued his duties as intelligence officer for the Air Corps. At the end of the war, Birch was sent, with several Chinese, on a mission into territory held by the Chinese Communists. He was killed on this mission. It's worth noting here, as we'll see in a minute, that he was actually working for the OSS at this time. And recall that we took a look at how the Nazi Party began as an intelligence front, and one of the things to look at here is how the people who are going to wind up in the John Birch Society or are associated with it in any way come from the military and intelligence communities. And take note also of General Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers. Those were the very famous fighter pilots.
He, and then especially his wife after he died, became very, very early proponents of the China lobby and were among the people that helped to start the entire McCarthy era off on its way by their allegations about waffling in the State Department and lukewarm support for anti-communist governments like Chiang Kai-shek's and accusations of this sort. Anyway, back to John Birch again and his military and his intelligence background. I'm going to read a short segment here from a book called The Secret File on John Birch, written by James and Marty Heffley, H-E-F-L-E-Y, copyright 1980 by Tyndall House Publishers, Inc. Okay. Although official U.S. policy viewed the communist movement as an internal problem, the Heffleys write, the Chinese would have to solve for themselves, the American military had been on the scene long enough to realize the potential danger to peace in China. Wiedemeyer and the OSS men were determined the communists would not take advantage of the end-of-war confusion. When John, that's John Birch, and Miller...
who basically, their shark-nosed P-40s became very famous during World War II. And Madame Chennault, really his widow, was a key element of the China lobby, but John Birch, in addition to working for OSS, is his intelligence advisor.
Yeah, while on one hand, the people who flew over the hump into China during the time that the Chinese were cut off from the ocean by the Japanese invasion are a justly famous, a heroic bunch, because the flying over the hump, over the mountains into China, was probably one of the most hazardous things in aviation at that time, and these were men who did this several times a week, sometimes several times in a day. And Chennault was undoubtedly a very brave flyer himself and his men, and they carried on for a long time themselves the war against the Japanese on behalf of the United States government when there was no official military commitment in China by the United States. However, on the other hand, as Dave mentioned, the name Chennault is a bit of a flag because later on, Chennault, who was a rabid supporter of Chiang Kai-shek, kept their morning radio schedule on August 19th. They learned that both were bound for the same city, Suzhou, where a large Japanese headquarters facility and airfield was located. In the euphoria of knowing that the war was over, they disregarded code and talked openly about how they would get there. Quote, I'm taking a junk down the Yellow, meaning the Yellow River, to Pengpu, and I'll catch the train north to Suzhou from there, Miller said. Why not come with me? Skipping on down. The next morning, John Birch, assembled his party. They included 3 other Americans, Lieutenant Laird Ogle, a specialist in morale intelligence, Sergeant Albert C. Myers, a radio technician, and Albert Grimes, a civilian OSS operative skilled in counter-espionage. Grimes wore a 14th Air Force captain's uniform and was second in command. Assisting the uniformed Americans were 5 Chinese officers and 2 Japanese-speaking Koreans who went along as interpreters. The group of 11 carried 27 pieces of baggage and 3 radios. One of the Chinese, Lieutenant Dung Fuquan,